Hi, folks. Welcome to the CHRO webinar. We are going to get started in just a few minutes. In the meantime, just want to remind everyone that we do have the ability to use either your computer audio or to use the call-in. So if you find that you're having any issues at this point with the audio features of the webinar, I would encourage you to go ahead and use the call-in option. All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with this ACPA Commission for Housing and Residence Life sponsored webinar. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ashley Robinson, and I'm a vice chair for the Commission for Housing and Residence Life. I'll be your host of our webinar today, which is titled Restorative RAs, Using Restorative Practices in the Resident Advisor Role. The Commission for Housing and Residential Life is really excited to share this webinar with you. This session is based on one of our sponsored programs that was presented at the ACPA 2019 convention in Boston. And as part of our continued efforts to provide high quality and accessible professional development opportunities to housing and residence life educators, our in-person convention-sponsored programs are all supplemented with a webinar and a blog post. So we're really grateful to our presenters for their commitment to wisely sharing their knowledge and insight to enhance other educators' learning and development. As we get started here, I just want to go over a couple of logistics. As I said before, if you're having any audio problems, I encourage you to go ahead and switch to a phone and to use the dial-in option. All audience members are automatically muted in the webinar. We will have a portion near the end of the webinar where we open it up to questions. What we'll be doing there is using the hand raise option, and I'll explain how to do that later on. I also want to make everyone in the audience aware that we are recording this webinar with permission from our presenter, and this recording will be available afterwards for you to watch or share, so you'll be getting a follow-up email from us tomorrow that has the recording to the webinar in it. So our presenter today is Brandin Howard. Brandin is joining us from the University of Vermont. We're really excited to have him with us. And I also want to recognize Paine Geraldo as a co-presenter for this session. Although she's unable to join us today in this webinar, I really want to recognize her work in developing this content and knowledge and presenting it at the convention this spring as well. So at this time, I'm going to turn things over to Brandin so we can go ahead and get going here.
All right, thank you, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brandin Howard. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am currently an assistant director for residential education at the University of Vermont, as sort of Ashley mentioned. And so thank you for joining us again from the University of Vermont. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today on restorative RAs. So this webinar really strives to sort of share how we at the University of Vermont operationalize and conceptualize the use of restorative practices with our RA, resident advisor staff. Similar to what Ashley just said, but I also want to make sure that I also give special credit to my co-presenter and friend, Paine, who couldn't be here today. She's also an assistant director of residential education here at the University of Vermont. Towards the end of our presentation, or this webinar, I'll make sure that everyone has our contact information, so there are some additional questions that folks may not necessarily have the chance to ask. We can be available to ask questions as well. Even though this was from convention, I do want to make sure that this is something that's very important, and so I wanted to make sure that this is incorporated into today's webinar in terms of the use of inclusive language. So we have an opportunity with ACPA in our webinars to provide an opportunity to discuss concepts that really do expand a variety of different audiences and contexts in higher education, tertiary education. And so we really ask that, as asking questions, and I challenge myself to do the same, making sure that we're using inclusive language in terms of recognizing gender pronoun use, different language around social identities, and being very inclusive around identity and diversity. So for a broad overview of this afternoon for today's webinar, we're going to start off with a little bit of a broad overview of RP, so sort of that 50,000 foot view of the RP framework. This won't be designed to give you every nook and cranny of the RP framework, but really just a very broad overview, so that way hopefully folks can understand how UVM operationalizes it and sort of how the different components make sense throughout our RA training and how we implement this with RAs. Then we're going to really get into that nitty-gritty of how we really, the different tangible ways that we really implement this with our RA team, and ways of how do we role model our restorative practices with our RAs, as well as how do we train, support, and supervise them in doing the same thing in terms of leading restoratively within their communities. Then we're going to wrap up with some successes and challenges, so some areas that at the University of Vermont we found have really worked, and what are some of the great things that have come from our use of RP in terms of a community development framework, as well as some challenges that we've noticed that we're also working to address. This session that way for folks who are at their home institutions striving to or considering using restorative practices with their RAs, some successes and challenges that you might want to be mindful of. And then we'll wrap up with questions, some general resources, and some contact information for everybody at the very end. As a result of this this webinar, we hope that provide and hope that everyone has the opportunity to understand really a broad overview of the restorative practices framework, and really its applicability to residential community building, learn about our approach to working with our RAs to implement the RP framework, especially with their residents and in their residential communities. And then there may be opportunity for you all to reflect on the potential application of the RP framework in your institution as well. To begin, we're going to start off with sort of like a very broad overview of the restorative practices. Again, this isn't designed to give you everything about the framework, but really hopefully that some little bits and pieces, so that way folks can sort of begin to see how this sort of fits together. So to begin with, the fundamental hypothesis with restorative practices is that human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them versus to them or for them. So with this hypothesis and with the components of restorative practices, we really work with our staff to think about how are we intentionally building and maintaining relationships within the community. And relationships and community building can take form in different ways, right? From how our RAs building community with their residents, how are the RAs building community with other RAs on their staff team that they're working with? How are we as supervisors building two-way relationships with our RAs as well? And so this doesn't necessarily just mean how to build relationships for RAs in their community, but this can be really thought of in a variety of different contexts. Another part of this is also thinking about how do we leverage those relationships to not only build strong community, but repair harm when it occurs. So when we think about harm, that can range from things like people have violated policy, which has caused a harm or a detriment to the community, to interstaff conflict. So really, how do we build those relationships so that way when harm occurs, everyone has an invested interest in repairing that harm and repairing the relationship. So in many ways, the restorative practices framework sort of like touched on can really be thought of as a community development framework, a supervisory framework, a leadership framework. It can be really used in a variety of different contexts within residential life and even student affairs as a whole. Even though today we're going to concentrate on how we use it with our RAs, just want to make sure that I put that little caveat out there that this could be used in a variety of different contexts. So when we think about the 4 core components of restorative practices, we think about the social discipline window, which is how we lead and how we put into practice our leadership, our supervision, our authority. Fair process is thinking about how do we engage others, especially in decision-making processes. Understanding shame and affect, so that's thinking about how do we understand and manage our emotions, as well as understand and manage the emotions of others, as well as the restorative practices continuum. How do we build and sustain relationships? In some ways, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a little bit, I think of the RP continuum as it's sort of like a vehicle that drives the other components of RP. So when we think about start off with the social discipline window. The social discipline window really does help us understand how do we lead and put into practice our authority. For example, how do we naturally lead with others? How do we naturally communicate when we work with others? When we introduce the social discipline window concept in RA training, we really strive to get folks thinking about, hey, think about someone who you respect as a mentor and a coach and how they would describe that person. Oftentimes in our training, we'll get responses such as, oh, my mentor and coach, they're really kind, they're trustworthy, they're supportive, they're always there for me. And then we sort of layer that on with, hey, then think about a time when that person had to hold you accountable or address something or they named the impact that you may have had on them. And sort of what was that experience like? And oftentimes we get responses such as they listened to my side, they held me accountable, but it was done with a sense of care and compassion. We really try to lay that framework to get folks thinking about, hey, who are those all-stars in their lives, those mentors and those coaches, and getting them to think about how they lead and what are the ways that they observe those mentors leading, and then we sort of go into the social discipline window. So when we think about the restorative practices, the social discipline window, it's 4 quadrants that operates on 2 main axes of control. So that's thinking about limit setting, expectations, what are the boundaries that I'm putting into place, as well as support. How are we giving encouragement? How are we giving support? How are we giving care? How am I also working with you to achieve the expectations that I've set forth? And so when we think about these 4 quadrants, when we think about high control but low support, that's considered the 2 box. That's a very punitive, rule-based approach to leadership and supervision. And so for us, the way we sort of conceptualize this for the RAs is that this can be the RA this is the RA that's practicing to be the next 4-star general in the Army. They are very rule-based. They're very top-down. What I say goes. This is also that RA that confronts a quiet hours incident, for example, and they go up to their residence room and they say, hey, based on our housing terms and conditions, Chapter 3, Paragraph 4, our quiet hours start at 4 p.m. It is now our quiet hours start at 10 p.m. It is now 10:04 p.m., so I am documenting you, and it doesn't matter if this is your first time breaking quiet hours. So really I'm following those expectations, I'm following the policy, but not a lot of support in that. Sort of the opposite for that is the 4 box. And so this is sort of thought of as more of a permissive form of leadership and working with others. So an example of this would be that same RA in a quiet hours incident that would that's overly permissive or overly accommodating for their residents. So this is the RA that says, okay, so I know this is the fifth time that I've had to remind you about quiet hours, so please remember that quiet hours start at 10 p.m. Oh, you're finishing, or the RA that says, oh, well, I see that you're finishing a basketball game, and yeah, it is after quiet hours, but as long as you're quiet after the basketball game, we'll let this slide, right? So that's really thought of that really high support, and we're giving that high level of encouragement and care, but not a lot of expectations or boundaries set in place. Then we have the not box. So this is thought of as sort of the negligent form or approach to leadership. When we have these conversations with our RAs, we often ask, hey, what are some words that you would use to describe a person in each of these boxes? One of the more popular terms that someone always normally says, this is the person that gets fired, right? And this is because this person the person who operates out of a not box is generally neglectful or ignoring or avoiding issues. So this is that RA that it's 2 a.m. in the morning, they hear a raging party, violating quiet hours, etc., but they don't feel like dealing with it, so they throw in some earplugs and turn over and go back to sleep, right? That willful ignoring, avoiding issues. So that's really low control and low support. This can also be the RA that is not present in their communities to recognize that there is a quiet hours issue or there's issues going on in their floor. And so ultimately we strive to work with our RAs and support them to lead with a sense of wit, really demonstrating high level of control and limit setting and high support. So for RAs, we help them conceptualize this as, this is the RA that is able to go up to their residence room and say, okay, so this is the second time that I've had to speak to you all about quiet hours, and so I am going to have to document this incident. Sort of what's coming up for you as I'm talking about documentation. This is also the RA that's able to name affect for their residents and be able to talk about sort of the impact, right? So this is the RA that says, hey, I got a name. I'm a little bit disappointed that I have to document you all for this quiet hours because it felt like you didn't pay attention to my first warning, and quiet hours really impact the community because it prevents other people from being able to sleep and study. Being able to nuance those conversations, not just having that not just being able to couple the policy enforcement piece of the documentation with also being able to name affect, ask questions, and being able to attend to the well-being and the perspectives of those that they're leading with, right? So one of the great things around the social discipline window is that it really helps us conceptualize for our RAs ways of leadership and putting into practice their authority and the positional power that they do have in a way that hopefully is a little bit less threatening for RAs, but it also really helps them think of different ways of managing unexpected behaviors. And RP really helps move interactions with students and interactions in general beyond just a punitive and permissive continuum, but really conceptualizes there are different ways of leading and putting into practice that authority. Those of us who are maybe up to date on current research on today's college students, we know that a lot of college students don't like the thought of being authority figures or having positional power. And so really the social discipline window also helps us conceptualize for the RAs the fact that it's all right, having positional authority or positional power in the RA role is not inherently bad, and it's not something to be worried or avoided or something to avoid, but really how you operationalize and how do you put into practice that positional authority that you have as an RA is what makes more of a difference. So really, when we talk about the social discipline window, we really try to get our RAs thinking about, hey, what is the way that you want to lead, and what is the way that you want to build your sense of community, and that also provides us an opportunity to talk a little bit about, hey, what is the approach to leadership, and what is the approach to being an RA that we hope that you have in our department as we build residential communities. Next, when we think about fair process, so reminding of that is how we think about how we engage, especially in decision-making process. So fair process is a theory out of the Harvard Business School that suggests that individuals are more likely to trust and cooperate freely with systems, whether they win or lose by those systems when fair process is observed. Now, throughout our RA training, we often emphasize that fair process is best used for engaging stakeholders in decisions that most directly impact them. So, an example, we wouldn't necessarily use fair process to decide what kind of pizza that we're going to order for the closing shift, right? But we may use fair process to engage our staff in a discussion of, hey, how are we going to break up closing shifts at the end of the academic year? So because fair process, we often talk about fair process, and fair process is really used for decisions that really impact, that can really carry a larger amount of impact for stakeholders. We often engage our RAs in fair process as supervisors more than they will engage in fair process with their residents. However, it's important for them that they know that framework, one, so that way we can be explicit with them around, hey, we're using fair process, and this is what fair process means. But sometimes our RAs use fair process when they engage among each other as RAs. So an example might be they may engage in fair process as a team when they decide amongst themselves how they're going to schedule duty, for example. So the fair process. So with fair process, there are three core principles for fair process. The first one is engagement. So this is when you involve individuals in decisions that affect them by asking them for input and allowing them to refute the merit, be able to sort of engage in discussion and sort of refute the merit or agree with the merit of another person's ideas and assumptions. So an example of this will be, hey, as a assistant director, I may say, hey, RAs have to do duty, have to do duty walks. Do we have two RAs on duty on the weekends or three RAs on the weekends, right? I'm approaching the RA staff and saying, hey, I have this decision to make. Here are the boundaries to that decision. What are folks' thoughts? People are able to engage in conversation. They are able to talk about what they think, maybe agree or disagree with other ideas that they've heard. And then as the leader or as the person making that decision, I go back, I take their feedback, I make a decision, and then after I made a decision, I go into explanation. That is where everyone involved and everyone affected should understand what the final decision is and the why behind the final decision. This really helps create a powerful feedback loop that helps enhance the learning for individuals. Because when we're able to say, hey, here's the decision that I've made and here's why I've made it, and here are the here's the elements of y'all's feedback that I'm taking into consideration. When I made this decision, not only do they get to understand sort of why I made the decision, but they also sort of learn from a leadership context. Okay, here are the things that Brandin considers. Here's the kind of things that Brandin kind of considers when making decisions. Here are the things he doesn't really consider, and that also helps them in terms of their learning that and their growth as well. With explanation, it is important to be able to make sure that you are sharing the why and sharing why and what parts of their feedback that you really took into consideration when when making a decision. So going back to our example, that might be me as a leader going back and saying, so we're going to have 3 RAs on duty for the weekend. I really heard y'all's feedback around, duty on weekends tends to be a little bit more busier for the RAs and have more incidents, and so we're going to have 3 RAs on duty. Now, I do understand, and then being able to talk, maybe sometimes even be able to talk about feedback that, didn't necessarily directly contribute to the decision, but really helped. So for an example, that might be, I heard some of you who talked about wanting only 2 RAs on duty. That sort of gives everyone more duty because that's more duty shifts that everyone has to cover. So what we're going to do is we'll also revisit what this looks like maybe next academic year in terms of whether we have 2 or 3 RAs. And then finally, after you've explained the decision, you explain the why, the feedback that you considered. This is where you as a leader talk about the new rules and make sure that the new rules are clearly stated. Everyone understands what to expect moving forward. So that way it sets folks up for success. So how are we as a team, or how are we as a group going to carry out the decision that I've made? So when we think about true fair process involves all three components. If you happen to miss one component, like you don't do explanation or you don't do the expectation clarity, it's not fair process. When we think about fair process, it's also important for RAs to understand what fair process is not, because sometimes they can misconstrue what the results or what their role in making the decision is when you engage in fair process. So fair process is not leaders forfeiting their prerogative to make decisions or establish expectations. So as a leader or as a supervisor, I'm still making the decision. I'm still holding on to that prerogative to do so. I am not forfeiting that by engaging in fair process. This does not set out to win support through compromise that accommodates everybody's needs. So this isn't where I'm engaging folks and saying, okay, let me figure out some way to take everyone's feedback and make sure everyone's feedback is incorporated into my decision. That's not really what fair process is. It's not decision making by consensus, so we're not voting. This isn't, it's not majority rule. It does not set out to achieve warm and fuzzy, make everyone feel warm and fuzzy, right? And that's one thing that sort of sometimes gets some of our RAs is that, hey, you didn't make the decision that I was hoping you made. You didn't really use fair process because I don't really feel good about this decision. Well, the point of fair process isn't necessarily to make people feel warm and fuzzy, but it's mainly, like I said, to include folks in the decision-making processes that impact them. It also does not seek to achieve harmony. So even though, through the end of the fair process, not everyone may still agree with the final decision, and that is okay. One of the things that we really talk to with our RAs with fair process and helping them understand is the fact that we really try to emphasize not using fake fair process. Fake fair process is where, as a leader, I've already made my decision. My decision is not going to change, but I'm still engaging folks in their feedback, making them think that their feedback is going to be taken into account as part of the decision-making process. And that also means that fake fair process is also when I'm engaging folks and I'm getting their feedback, and their feedback is not going to influence the decision. So oftentimes, as part of my role here at UVM, I also oversee our RA recruitment and selection. And so one of the big things I normally get every year is, especially from some of our returning RAs who are familiar with this framework, that they might sometimes come back to me and say, well, Brandin, you didn't really use fair process in determining where I got placed next year. And my response is often, yeah, you would be right, because this would not be a decision where I am using fair process. And then I go through and I sort of explain that not all decisions that are made require or are going to be a fair process discussion. So there are some decisions that as a leader I'm going to make that decision, and I'm going to provide as much support and clarity in carrying out that decision. But this is not really going to be a fair process moment. Some of those decisions, like for example, whether RAs go on duty or not, we're not going to use fair process to discuss whether RAs are going on duty or not. Now we might have fair process. We might engage RAs in fair process on, hey, what are the duty walk times? What do we have 2 or 3 RAs on the weekends? But we're not having fair process about whether you're going on duty or not. It's very important to make sure help RAs understand that nuance. But through the use of fair process, we really hope that fair process strives to achieve. It helps build trust and commitment. That trust and commitment produces voluntary cooperation, and that voluntary cooperation helps build community, which then leads folks to feel more connected and more creative and more interested in the success of all, and helps build a level of trust. So ultimately, we use fair process as much as possible when we make decisions across different levels in our department, Mainly because, one, again, we want to make sure that voices are being heard whenever possible, but also by engaging in genuine fair process where we're also engaging folks in the decision, and we're also being very transparent and explicit around why we made the decisions and what they can expect moving forward. That really helps build that trust, which then in turn we hope, because of that trust, even if they didn't get the decision that they want, they trust the fact that I, as a leader, have made a decision that I felt was in the best interest, and I did take everyone's opinions into account when I made that decision. Next, when we think about sort of understanding shame and affect, we think about sort of what is the emotion. We sort of think about emotion. Think about the emotional aspect of being in the RA role or in general. Nathanson and Tompkins, even though Tompkins is not on this slide, they postulated that humans are born with 9 innate affects. So what we mean by 9 innate affects is that these are affects that we don't necessarily learn. We sort of biologically programmed to experience these 9 affects. They range from enjoyment and joy to surprise, startle, shame, anger, fear, the smell. So for the smell, when you think about, some of us went to ACPA this past March, and you may be from California. You're like, hey, I've never been to Boston before. I'm going to take an extra week, and then but you forgot that you left your spoiled milk in your refrigerator, and then you go back, and that smell, that natural smell of this or face that you make of disgust because you smell that spoiled milk in your refrigerator. That's what we think about when we talk about the smell. But when we think about, so understanding the 9 affects and understanding this can be kind of tricky for our RAs to conceptualize. So the way we sort of help them understand it is that when we ask them through RP to name their affect and name what's coming up for them, this is sort of what we're talking about. What's coming up for you at this moment? Name your affect. And that also gives RAs the ability to say, I'm going to name. I was pretty angry about that decision, or I'm very excited that we're going bowling for staff bonding, right? Being able to name that affect. Now, when you look at the slide, you may notice that shame and humiliation is in a different color, and that's because shame really does play a different and a very valuable role in understanding and managing emotions of their residents, but also managing their own emotions, right? So when we understand shame is defined as the interruption of positive affect. So what that means is that, an example we often give RAs is, I'm a resident, I'm in my room, I have friends over, I'm having a party, I have alcohol, I'm having fun, and that initial knock at the door, and hearing the announcement, hey, RAs, open up, please. That's what we consider that interruption of positive affect. And I'm going into that shame moment. In conflict, most people experience shame. So in that same example, the residents are experiencing shame because, okay, I'm about to get busted for an alcohol violation. The RAs are experiencing shame because they had to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning. They had to get dressed. They had to go get their duty partner, and they had to go and address this. They had to address this alcohol violation, and they don't know what's going to happen in this scenario. So in conflict, most people experience shame. Humans typically look down and to the left when shame is felt, as a general biological response. Now, the way we sort of explain this for our RAs and really help them conceptualize it is that when you think about shame, there are 4 basic reactions to shame, which we consider the compass of shame. And so, in shame, there are 4 different responses. So taking our alcohol situation, for example, there's withdrawal. So that's isolating oneself, running and hiding. So in the moment, that's that student that the RA knocks on the door and they go hide in the closet or hide under the bed, hoping that the RA doesn't see them and they can avoid that documentation. There's also attack self, so that tends to be self put down. So That's that RA that messes something up and then says, just fire me, you'd be better off. Or that resident that says, you know, you should just kick me out of school then, I really screwed this up. Avoidance, which is really thought about as denial, so really refusing to see the issue, refusing or failing to see an issue. So in that situation, that might be the resident that says, I don't know what the big deal is around me drinking in my room. What's the big deal? Oh, I don't think there's an issue about me violating quiet hours. And then attack others. So that's really where, in a moment of shame, folks turn the tables, blame others, maybe lash out verbally. So you know, the classic line that we often hear in Res Life, this is that resident that says, this alcohol policy sucks. I pay $60,000 a year to be here, and so I should be able to do whatever I want in my room when I want to. You're a bad RA for writing me up, right? So we really help RAs understand the compass of shame because it really helps them put into context sort of what are some of their natural reactions when they're experiencing shame, but also sort of what their residents may be experiencing when they're going through shame. So, and the way we also explain this for our RAs is that shame should not be used as a weapon. So the purpose of knowing the compass of shame is not to try to make people feel shame or make them feel bad, but it's not meant to be used as a diagnostic tool. So it's not like, oh well, you're going to attack others, so I think you're experiencing shame. That's not what the point of this is. But the point and the goal of our RAs in learning the compass of shame is so that way they can recognize when they are in shame. That way they can reflect on their behavior, their actions, what their role is in the conflict, so they can move from shame to responsibility. But it also helps them determine a response for when someone else is in shame, right? So going back to that attack others example, an RA who understands and is able to recognize that a student is experiencing shame, you know, they're not going to necessarily go back on the defensive. They may not necessarily go back on the defensive and attack back when their residents may verbally lash out at them. They may circle back around and hold them accountable and name impact later, be able to say, you know, when you said I was a bad RA when I had to document you, that really hurt because I try my best in the RA role, right? So they may go back and name affect and hold folks accountable, but in that moment, if they understand that compass of shame, they may not necessarily. The hope is that they are able to use that compass of shame to sort of gauge how they respond when other folks are experiencing shame. And then finally, the fourth component of the Restorative Practices framework is the RP continuum. So this is a spectrum of informal to formal interactions that folks can have when they're engaging with others, whether they're their residents, with other RAs, with their supervisors. So when we think about affective statements and questions, that's being able to ask a question that elicits a affective response or a response of emotion, and that affective statement is that expression of emotion. So that might be, hey, okay, so hey, insert RA here. I know I had to document you for being late for duty for the second time. What's coming up for you, or how did that land with you? That question is really that affective question, and then what the response tends to be is that affective statement, being able to say, I was upset when you documented me, but I understand it now. Small impromptu circles allow folks to gather up and discuss an impactful event relatively quickly. So this is oftentimes when, for example, an RA goes to that room to address a quiet hours violation. For our RAs, we help them conceptualize that as a small impromptu circle. You're quickly gathering folks together to address or discuss an impactful event or address behavior in the moment. Group circles tend to be a little bit more formal, and these can be used proactively and responsively. So with proactive circles, that allows individuals an opportunity to, individuals within a community, an opportunity to get to know each other, build relationships, maybe share information, or really talk about significant things that are coming up. In responsive circles, we often use responsive circles with our RAs, and we ask our RAs to use responsive circles in our communities to address significant events. So sometimes that's, there's a bias incident that occurs on the floor, vandalism, ongoing issue around alcohol that's happening in the community. The RAs, with the support of their supervisors, will often circle up together to do a group circle to address the impact in the community. Formal conferences are considered very, very structured and very formal. So at UVM, we very seldom use formal conferences because the amount of prep work beforehand that a formal conference requires is a lot, right? If you're interested in seeing what a potential formal conference looks like, one video that we used to show for our RAs is called Burning Bridges. You can find that on YouTube. But that also gives you that will sort of give you an idea of what that formal conference looks like and sort of the intensity of the preparation work that goes into facilitating a formal conference. Now, when I talk about the RP continuum and I talk about the use of circles, I feel it's very important to recognize and name that components of RP and restorative practices have been around for centuries. Most notably, the use of circles as a way of engaging communities, solving communal issues. They've been used by a wide variety of indigenous cultures for centuries. And so the use of circles and using circles to build community is not a brand new thing. The International Institute for Restorative Practices did not create that. But that is a practice that has been embodied by many indigenous cultures for centuries. So it's important to name and acknowledge that. When we think about circles, we think about three types of circles. One of which is sequential. So as you sort of look in, as part of this webinar, there's also a handout where we provided you all with some sample meeting agendas of circle scripts that we provide our RAs for different points in the year. Within those circles, there are often sequential questions. These are specific questions that are done in a specific order. So in an opening circle, this is an RA. A sequential question might be, "Hi, so please go around and share your name, where you're from, your preferred pronouns if you're comfortable, and one thing you're excited about being at UVM." They select a volunteer. That volunteer decides if they're going to go to the left or to the right. So that way, the person that's next has the opportunity to prepare. They pass along. They have a talking piece, and then they share that as well. Then also within the same circle, you may have non-sequential circles. These tend to be structured or unstructured questions with no particular order, and expectations for participation is more relaxed. Oftentimes, when we have circles that our RAs or our staff is facilitating a circle that can be emotionally charged in nature, especially around like, hey, we're here to discuss the impact that this bias incident on the floor had. We are often used to say, hey, what came up for you when you found out that this slur was written on a bulletin board? That's a non-sequential circle where we don't want to necessarily force or require everyone to name that, right? Because not everyone in that space may be comfortable doing so. So that may be questions that are challenged by choice. And then fishbowls tend to be non-sequential or sequential circles. And these fishbowl circles tend to be used for idea generation and to gather feedback. So being able to bring your community together to dialogue around an issue or a problem and problem solve together as a group. The key to success of circles that we found at UVM is that circles should not be seen as a special event, right? But circles are really a way of how we do business in residential life. An example sort of this is really we had a training meeting with our summer RAs just a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't even get them into a circle, but the RAs were like, hey, can we stop and can we get into a circle? Because the kind of joke was, we don't even know how to engage in a meeting without being in a circle anymore. And while that RA was joking, that really speaks to the culture that we've worked hard to build here in residential life, in that RAs know that whenever we're gathering together, whenever we're meeting, we're doing so in circles. It's really a way that we do business. So the reasons why we really emphasize the use of circles is it provides a level of equality. Everyone is there. It's a way to sort of minimize or sort of dilute a little bit positional power. Everyone has an equal role in the success of that circle. It helps establish safety and trust. So so everyone can be seen, everyone can be heard, no one can really hide in a circle. Everyone has everyone has a responsibility for the success of the circle and making sure that they are contributing to the circle and building the community. It reminds you as a facilitator to facilitate, right? So you can't, in a circle, you don't get to sort of ask them questions and then sort of go off to the side or go into the back of the room, but it really reminds you to facilitate as a facilitator. It really helps build connections with community members through promoting a sense of ownership for everybody that is a part of that circle. So that's the four core components of RP, and that's really how we sort of train, and a little bit of a discussion on sort of how we sort of train and work with RAs to understand these four components. So some other ways. So really, our implementation for RAs begins with training. Every year, every fall training, we do a 2-day training with our RAs where they learn about the background of restorative practices. They learn the four core components. We go much more in depth than what I just did. We give them opportunities to practice proactive and responsive circles. Part of that is helping them practice, different responsive scenarios that they'll more likely run into as an RA. Practice the opening circle for when their new residents come into the floor. And then we also give them an opportunity to create some practice circle questions. So that way they begin to develop the competence in developing circle agendas. And then as much as possible, we really begin to set that culture of using RP as much as possible in other trainings. So, using it as much as possible, and how do we weave that into other trainings? So, for example, how to be restorative and use RP when you're documenting residents in a policy violation. So when we're having training around policies and procedures, we also sort of weave in restorative practices as well as a way of engaging. We also, again, with our RAs, we really use a lot of proactive circles. So again, the vast majority of the ways we engage as a department at UVM is through the use of circles, through opening circles with their residents. So, the residents coming at the very beginning of the year. Their floor meetings, because those are done in circles. Health and safety inspection circles, so that's where they get their residents together and say, hey, health and safety inspections are coming up. Here are the things that you need to keep in mind. Semester closing, so they're disseminating information around what they need to know for semester closing. General community building, so they come together to build community. Sometimes this is coupled with different community programs. And staff meetings is another big way that we use circles with our RAs. So as supervisors, and we have our RA staff meetings, we do that in circles as well. And then we use one-on-one staff meetings as a way to do circles as well in implementing RP. Using one-on-ones to talk about name, badge, what's coming up for folks, asking those questions, etc. Responsively, we really do, again, like I mentioned earlier, we really use this as a way to engage the community, especially when there's when harm has been done or a critical incident occurs. So this could be there's a staff conflict happening between the whole staff or a few RAs. We'll do a responsive circle to sort of address that conflict. Bias, vandalism, and other for community impacts. We often do circles to address student death when that occurs. Those circles typically are facilitated by professional staff members, but RAs are often present and involved with those circles as well. We often talk about we also do responsive circles for events for things that happen at a university, state, or national level. So when large-scale critical incidents, like bias incidents happen at a national level, we'll still often do responsive circles with the community to also support them by giving them providing a space of name, impact, and how can they come together to as a community to support each other as a community. So some successes and challenges that we found in terms of implementing the RP framework for our RAs is that we've noticed that our RAs feel more confident in building community than they were before. Before we brought in the Restorative Practices framework, our staff we would often say, okay, RAs, your role is to build community. But sometimes our staff would struggle to explicitly name how to build community. What does building community mean? Likewise, our RAs would struggle with how do I do that? And so the Restorative Practices framework really gives our staff a solid framework for guiding RAs on how to build community, but also as a framework for how to build, and gives the RAs the framework to work from through providing different mechanisms to do so. It aids RAs in being able to navigate difficult conversations and situations. So kind of a script-based and using affective statements and questions to address harm to help mediate conversations. It really also provides a strong rationale for RAs of why proactive community building is important. One of the key aspects of RP is that the responsive circles and responsive mechanisms of RP are not as successful if there isn't that proactive community building done first. So it reminds RAs that policy enforcement is only one half of the equation. They also have to work hard to proactively build community. So that way students have an investment in the community and they become more invested in repairing harm when it comes up. And then it provides a mechanism for community members to feel heard. Some challenges that we face that we still continue to work on is, again, sometimes proactive community building isn't prioritized. As an RA, do I have the time or do I have the desire to making sure that I'm consistently maintaining and building community with my residents? So sometimes that proactive community building isn't prioritized. Sometimes another challenge is that the RA, in terms of RAs fully understanding the buy-in to the Restorative Practices framework. So sometimes RAs feel that when you use RP, it's meant to substitute accountability processes, or they may say, well, you're not being really restorative because you're having an accountability conversation. An example might be, hey, you gave me a written warning, you weren't really being restorative. And it's important for RAs and folks who implement RP, it's important for folks to understand and recognize that part of RP helps guide conversations through helping both sides feel heard and valued. And RP is used as a supplement to the accountability process. It doesn't mean that it replaces it. So in a documentation conversation with an RA, for example, we often train our professionals and graduate staff to use RP to help facilitate the conversation, but you still may be introducing punitive consequences such as documentation, written warning, termination, that kind of stuff. Another challenge is that RP it takes time and energy to be very intentional in using RP and being restorative. Sometimes our natural inclination is to sort of be more towards the to box or the not box in terms of being very punitive and being very directive, or being like, okay, you know what, I'll just do it myself, or I'll just do it for you. And so it takes intentionality to lead restoratively. And so sometimes that poses a challenge for our RAs. So to wrap up, before I turn to questions, I like to also promote these resources. So the International Institute of Restorative Practices really helped serve as a foundation and provide framework for the restorative practices model that we use here at UVM. I also recommend taking a look at Building Campus Community, Restorative Practices in Residential Life. This is a very good book that really talks about the components of RP, and it's really written from a residential life RA context. The first chapter is written by Dr. Stacy Miller, who was our previous director for residence life at UVM, and she talks about the journey around bringing RP to UVM back in 2009. And then finally, again, contact information. Pioneer's email address is there. There's my current email address. I am transitioning to another institution within the next few weeks, and so you may get a bounce back if you email me, but I will still respond to emails if you send it to my UVM email address as well. So with the time that I have left, I want to turn it over for some questions. To ask a question, if you can please, again, use the raise your hand feature, and make sure you're also unmuted on your computer so that way we can hear your questions. Thank you.
And also for folks who, if you want to type a question into the question box, if you don't want to ask a question out loud, we'll also take questions that way. Okay, so I'll be looking for raised hands here for anybody that has a question or wants to go ahead and type it right into the question box. Okay. So we've got a question. Brandin, if you could just give us again the name of that book that you just recommended and where one might find a copy of that book, if you can let us know.
Oh, happy to. I'll actually go back to this. I'll actually go back to the slide. So the book is called Building Campus Community, a handbook for resident advisors. You can find the book on the International Institute for Restorative Practices website. You can also, the last I checked, you can also get it on Amazon as well. So if you Google it, you can find it on Amazon. I think sometimes Barnes and Noble carries it, but primarily Amazon or the IRP website will have that. The IRP website has like a little store section where you can find this book.
Great, thanks. So we've got another question here. I'd love to hear more about incorporating RP into programming and community building. We're looking to use circles as a potential programming option for RAs. Do you have a set curriculum for doing this?
That's a great question because some of the work that UVM is currently doing is that we're working to build our restorative practices curriculum, where in part is sort of how our RAs really engage with their communities in a community learning model / curriculum format. So that is some work that is currently ongoing here at the University of Vermont. Oftentimes, as part of our curriculum, our RAs will often have, as part of that curriculum, we're going to have like set circles for like different meetings and closings and stuff like that, and we're working to standardize those circle agendas and those circle prompts, so that way, when we get to those points where where we have a facilitated circle coming up, where we're asking all RAs to hold this circle, we are also going to have a curriculum and here's what that circle agenda looks like. So that's a great question, and that's some work that we're also currently working on as well at UVM.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we've got a question about fair process. So when you're talking with RAs and you tell them that you're not using fair process to make a decision, how do you deal with the pushback they may give if they think that they need to be part of that decision-making process, or they think that it should be a fair process situation?
That's a very good question. I think part of what's important is also being explicit in terms of why we're not using fair process. And I think that sort of helps with that pushback, is saying, hey, okay, this is not a decision that we're going to use fair process, and here's the why. 8 to 9 times out of 10, depending on the year, RAs get that and they leave it at that, and or they still disagree, but they won't push back further because you gave them the rationale. But from then on, if they still continue to push back, I think that's at that point where, now I can't speak for some of my colleagues. That's kind of maybe where I start slipping a little bit towards that 2 box of saying, okay, so here's the rationale. We're not going to engage in fair process in this discussion, and here's the why. And so we're going to move on from this conversation. So sometimes being able, as the leader, be able to have that. But I think part of that is as the leader having a clear understanding for yourself of why you're not using fair process, and being confident and comfortable in that. So for me, when I talk about RA placement, I tell them that there are so many different factors that go into RA placement that outweigh your personal preferences. And so for me, I'm not going to be using fair process to determine your RA placement for next year, because that's fake fair process, and I would, and more likely than not, I would have to ignore the feedback you gave me for your preferences. So I'm not using fair process, and I try to make that very explicitly clear for them, so that way they understand the context and the why.
Mm-hmm. And you're still being pretty open and transparent about the process behind the process, right? Which is maybe more fair than it could be, right?
Exactly. And that's sort of that key part, and that's one of the good things about the RP framework, is that as a leader, it really pushes you to be explicit and clear with those you lead and supervise. And so I can't just, and so with most decisions, I think over time in using the RP framework, I've naturally gotten to the point now where I'll say, hey, here's my decision, here's why I made it, here's why I didn't involve y'all in the discussion, right? And I'll just organically do that. But for me, when I was first learning the RP framework, especially the use of fair process and using RP, it reminded me to be very explicit around the why when I can, right? And sometimes you might have to make a decision in a moment that you can't, and sometimes you can't make a decision in a moment and you don't have time to say, hey, I didn't involve you in this decision, and why. And sometimes you may not be able to have that conversation right then and there. And so it also reminds you but also it's important to be intentional in terms of circling back around to your team or to your staff and say, hey, I want to circle back around and say, and give you more of that context of why I didn't involve y'all in this discussion. But I think that's very important.
Right. So we've got one last question here. It's a great question. These are all great questions. So is your 2-day RP training in addition to other fall RA training sessions, or is your training only 2 days?
For our RAs, currently our training is 2 weeks long. Because we also do a whole different some different other value core components of our training, including diversity, inclusion, crisis management, policy, and procedure. But we spend 2 days with our RAs on RP training because for us in order for RP to be successful, it goes back to really establishing and setting a culture of using restorative practices. And so for us at UVM, it's important for us to making sure that we're taking that intentional time to really walk our RAs through that. So yeah, our RA training may be a little bit longer than some other institutions, but for us that time is really well spent and it's really worth it because that's really the key to the success, or one of the keys to success for us in terms of maintaining a restorative culture.
Wonderful. Well, on behalf of CHRL, I want to thank Brandin so much for joining us in this presentation today. I want to thank everybody who attended. As I said, there will be a follow-up email that goes out tomorrow that has the full recording of this webinar so you can revisit it or share it with your colleagues. There were some great visuals and other information that Brandin presented that I'm sure a lot of you will want to take another look at. I also encourage you all to follow CHRL on Facebook or on Twitter, where you can learn more about this presentation. You can read the blog post that Brandin and Paine wrote in the spring, and also other upcoming webinars that we will be hosting. So thank you again, Brandin. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. And everyone, take care. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.